Hello and welcome to another episode of Graham Hughes' PUBCAST.
Though we're not in a pub.
Thank you, Adam. Today I'm joined by Adam Lee of Interrupting Me fame, and also Richard Corbett, MEP, who's one of the longest serving British MEPs. How many years now is it that you've...
It's hard to keep track of. It changes every year.
Yeah? Is it... See what you did there?
Yeah.
So was it 18 years, I think I read on Wikipedia?
Yeah, something like that. I was out for 5 years as well, and I came back.
Okay. And so what we want to talk about today, if you don't mind, is just about the European Parliament, because from a lot of the people on the other side of this debate, they say that the EU is either communist or fascist, and they're very sure that it is undemocratic. So could you go through with us, as though we are incredibly stupid, which we probably are, but how does the EU work, and how different is it to what we're used to with our parliamentary system in the UK?
Yeah, sure. Well, the EU does adopt legislation in a limited number of fields. I think the House of Commons Library says it's about 12% of our legislation are laws that we do jointly with our neighbouring countries in the European Union, mostly about common rules for the common market, consumer protection standards, environmental rules, workplace rights.
So with these common rules, that would be you make a product and then you can sell it in all countries, as long as it's okay in one country.
Because we've agreed common rules, anything made in Britain is legally, you can legally sell it anywhere across Europe without further ado, without form filling, testing, paying or anything.
Okay, fab.
Because we've agreed common rules on products. And those rules are important to protect consumers, to have environmental standards, and also about how they're made, workplace rights, so you don't have unfair competition by undercutting on health and safety, for instance. Now, fine, we adopt legislation at European level. Is that done by this great bureaucracy that just tells us what to do, which is what many people think?
Well, that's what, we hear that a lot.
Yeah. Well, the European Commission, actually, first it's quite small. It has about the same number of employees as Leeds City Council down the road here. It's not that big. But its job is to propose, it doesn't decide on European legislation. Any laws that we make at European level have to be approved by two bodies. The Council, that is the minister from every country's elected government around the table, and the European Parliament, directly elected MEPs. So there's a double democratic check on every proposal.
So they can't just railroad through any proposition that they want?
No. All the more so, as in the Council, the ministers, you need a qualified majority. That's 3/4 of the votes weighted by the population of the member states. So the idea that you can ram things through that national governments don't want is really far-fetched.
Okay.
I think you're going to do most of the talking. I'll actually give you the mic.
And MEPs
I'll just boom this way and you'll...
we'll pick
MEPs have softer voices than MPs because we don't have to bellow across a noisy chamber all the time. We actually have microphones because of the interpretation, so we're not so used to having these big booming voices.
Do you find that so by its nature, it's that the European Parliament is a lot more collaborative than our Parliament and what we're used to?
It is. It's permanently hung parliament. There's no overall majority just for one party. We sit by political affinity: socialists, liberals, greens, conservatives, and so on.
So Labour MEPs sit with other of the equivalent Labour Party in Germany, or
the Socialist and Democrat group. So with our sister parties, the French Parti Socialiste, the Irish Labour Party, the Dutch Labour Party, the Swedish Social Democrats, and so on. And so we work with them. We don't sit in national delegations. And that makes sense, because dividing lines, it's very unusual to see everybody from one country voting one way and everybody from another country voting the other way. The disagreements are about, do you want higher environmental standards but at greater cost or not? There'll be people on both sides of that argument in every country. It's a political division, not a national one.
So it's worked pretty well so far as the EU. But people often say that it needs reform and it needs to get better. What are the sort of the points that you would like to see change from a democratic point of view to make people feel more included in the European movement?
Well, the EU is a permanent negotiation among its 28 countries. It's constantly evolving usually slowly, but over a period of years it does. So this democratic thing we were starting to discuss there, 15, 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. Commission would make a proposal, the European Parliament would just give an opinion, and the ministers in the Council would take the decision behind closed doors. That's changed completely.
So that was since
but
the
perceptions
Maastricht
have lagged. Maastricht first brought that in, and it's been expanded. So now
1992.
all legislation needs the approval both of the Council and the Parliament. Now the Parliament, I will say it compares very well in one respect and very badly in another respect with the House of Commons.
Okay.
Compares badly, perhaps, in terms of the theatre and the drama of politics. The House of Commons, you've got government and opposition, two sword lengths apart. There's lively debate, they interrupt, they give way, there's banter back and forth. It makes good television. Sometimes.
We were all up until all hours this week.
European Parliament, the debates aren't terribly sexy. You've not got government and opposition in that same sense, and you've got the multiplicity of languages. So people have earphones on for interpretation because nobody speaks all 22 languages, which in turn means you can't easily interrupt or heckle. It's take it in turns to speak, and if you tell a joke, you know, some people might laugh straight away. Not usually, not if it's one of mine, but
about a
few seconds later, another group are laughing, and then by the time you've moved on to make your next point, which is a really solemn and serious point, there's a ripple of laughter across the room. So in terms of the debates, it can be gripping, but not so often.
Yeah.
However, when it comes to shaping legislation, normally, we're in an unusual situation now in Britain, but normally the House of Commons is a rubber stamp parliament. If the government proposes a bill, that will be the outcome.
Yeah.
You know, they'll have a good debate on it, that's important, but they don't actually shape it.
Yeah.
It's headline news if an amendment's adopted against the will of the government. Shock, horror, what's happened? Government's falling. No. Whereas in the European Parliament, a Commission proposal really is a first draft. That's their job, to make a draft.
Right.
And if we don't like it, we amend it, we reshape it, we rework it. The detailed work is done in parliamentary committees, a bit like in the US Congress, where members have the time to get to know the subject and become a bit specialist on it. And the style of working is different. So, whereas in Westminster a good MP is a good debater, laying into the other side, scoring points. But then when it comes to voting, they all automatically vote this way or that way according to their government or opposition. In the European Parliament, it's not so much a good debater that's a good MEP, it's somebody who's good at explaining, persuading and negotiating with colleagues from different countries.
See that in Britain.
It's a real parliament. The word parliament, parler in French, to talk things through. It's the place you talk things through to shape legislation.
Pirates of the Caribbean.
Aha, there you are.
It's all highbrow stuff with Graham and myself, as you can tell.
So, but what do you think the main things that the EU could improve on in order to get more Eurosceptics, as they used to be called, on board?
Well, for a start, to make sure more people understand how it really works, rather than what some of our tabloid newspapers would have you believe.
That's a very good point, because I've been saying for a long time that the problem here, and Graham said this, we've had 30 years of propaganda against the EEC, then the EU, and this is. I don't know why, when you consider the Daily Mail, I mean, I'm 46, so I don't remember joining the common market as it was.
Were you drunk at the time?
I think I was 2 years old, so knowing my mother, yes, she probably put whiskey in the milk. But when it comes to, I'll read back through archives of what's been said in newspapers. The Daily Mail was very much positive for joining the common market, and I mean, the Daily Mail changed its mind. I mean, they thought Hitler was a good guy at one stage, didn't they? But and I can't. I'm wondering where it's gone horribly wrong with these rags, And it's interesting that Liverpool, where Graham's originally from, and I think you said earlier that you're from there originally, or around those areas. Southport, sorry.
The boycott of the sun.
Yeah. Right, yeah. But it's particularly in Liverpool, they voted largely for Remain, and
58%.
And they're now saying this week that some of the reason for that is because they've boycotted the Sun newspaper after what they said about the Hillsborough disaster.
I need to qualify that as well, because although that would have been a slight factor, also Liverpool enjoyed 1.9 billion from the Objective 1 funding through the 90s and the 40s.
So did South Wales, and they didn't vote. At the time, they didn't vote because it wasn't well known enough. Whereas Liverpool, it was well known.
Yeah, because
Manchester, though, where there wasn't a boycott of the Sun newspaper, they voted 60% to remain. Higher remain.
But I mean, but this is what
most of the great northern cities, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, York, Newcastle, all voted Remain.
Even Durham City itself voted Remain.
I don't know what it was in Sheffield, but in my constituency, I'm in John Healy's constituency, which is Wentworth and Dearn, I think they call it, which is one of the Rotherham constituencies. That was something like 65% for Leave. Rotherham, which is Sarah Champion's constituency, that was 67% for Leave. But Rotherham benefited from a lot of EU funding. Sheffield benefited from a lot of EU funding as well after the demise of the coal mines and the steelworks. And in fact, because I got made redundant, the EEC at the time was paying a proportion of my salary, a significant proportion, for me to retrain. And well, I stayed in engineering, but I upskilled and I got further qualifications. And there was a couple of guys from the area who became pilots. I'm thinking, damn, I wish I'd thought of that, But
but you could have gone to every country in the world.
Well,
you would have polluted the world a lot more
by flying. Yes,
Your point on the newspapers. If you measure our national newspapers by readership statistics, which is a good way to measure their influence. Over 2/3 are in the hands of just 3 owners. Yeah,
we've talked about this a lot. So please go on.
Yeah, well, you know already, Murdoch, the Barclay brothers, and Rothermere, essentially.
Right.
And from the Times to the Sun, there's been a deliberate policy of being anti-Europe, and all these Euro-myths that
Boris
constantly
Johnson
there, that Boris Johnson invented. Sometimes they're funny, the one that the Commission allegedly was going to propose to standardise the measurements of condoms across Europe, and the size they proposed was too small to cater for British assets. And we all had a good laugh. But there was, of course, no truth in it whatsoever. But, year after year, drip, 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 things trying to make the EU look silly or sinister or threatening or pointless, whatever.
An expensive, pointless exercise.
If that's all, if you're not terribly interested, that's all you read about the European Union, you'd think the whole thing was bonkers, wouldn't you?
Well, exactly.
But also, and something that we touched on before we started doing this interview, I studied politics at A level, government and politics. I got an A, actually.
Well done.
Surprise of everyone, not least me. We didn't touch on the EU at all.
No. They didn't give you this book to read?
No, it's a fabulous book. The European Union, How Does It Work, which has been co-authored by Richard here, and also the European Parliament.
So, you see, we don't just plug Graham's books.
And this is great. For anybody who suffers from insomnia, this is also very recommended.
All right, fantastic,
It's like a big sleeping pill. But so I studied in Manchester University, I did politics and modern history, and again, we didn't study the EU. We didn't touch on it at all. I can't remember if it was one of the modules that I could pick, but I don't think it was. It might have been. Feel free to correct me, anybody did PMH in 1997.
But before 2016, and I moved back to the UK on the day before Christmas Eve, the 23rd of December 2014, I moved back to the UK after years abroad, and all of a sudden there's this guy on the television all the time ranting about how undemocratic the EU is and all this kind of stuff. But nobody talked about this before I left the UK. Nobody, when I came back on visits, nobody mentioned. Sorry?
When did you come back?
2014.
Yeah.
And so you can blame me, I guess.
It's not your fault.
And that guy was Farage, was it?
Yes. I'm trying to be polite about him.
The man who's elected to the European Parliament, gets on the fishing committee when that was dealing with a much-needed reform to the common fisheries policy, and attended one meeting out of 42, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
or
something.
24, I can't remember.
No, it was in the 40s, wasn't it? Yeah. And so when nobody used to worry about being in the EU. It was great. You got your cheap booze from France and you loaded up the car, or you got your cheap holidays in Spain and you could just walk in there and you could retire there. And all of a sudden, over the last 3 or 4 years, I feel like I've come to a country that, it's completely alien to me. And especially because I lived in New Zealand and then I lived in Australia, and those countries have got a common migration policy. They've got their own immigration departments, but you can travel and work in each other's countries, relatively easily. They do put restrictions on people.
Just like we have here in Europe.
Yeah, but and the Australians put restrictions on people, and the New Zealanders do, on Australian citizens with criminal records. They have to apply for a proper visa, which we had the power to do, but we chose not to.
Yeah, most migration to Britain, by the way, is from outside the EU, which is entirely a matter for British rules. Yeah. Within the EU, we have a reciprocal agreement on free movement, with many Brits going and living in other EU countries as well. And if they all suddenly come back, especially those that retired, and suddenly burden the NHS, we'll have a bit of a problem.
Yeah. Well, and also a lot of the NHS have got so many Europeans who come and work here.
5% of Britain's population are from other EU countries. 10% of our EU doctors and nurses are from other EU countries.
So there's a high proportion of, like, there was a guy getting interviewed on LBC, and he heard of there was a particular skill shortage for doctors in his speciality in Grimsby, and he drove from Italy to Grimsby to apply for a job here, and now is treated like he's some kind of leper, which is heartbreaking, and I don't know where that came from.
Well, you said that back in the day, people were like, "Oh, we're part of the EU. That's ace." I don't remember that ever happening. I don't remember ever seeing something on the TV saying how great it was.
No, but
we were part of the EU.
It was more like people didn't care. It was just
people didn't care.
We were in the EU, but now they're vehemently opposed to it.
It wasn't a controversy initially. No, it was turned into one. And going back to this allegation that it's all undemocratic, we just dealt with legislation. You can't approve any legislation without the elected European Parliament approving it, and ministers from elected governments in the Council. On top of that, any proposal now, this is the last 10 years only since the Lisbon Treaty, is first sent to the national parliaments. You have an 8-week period to look at it and mandate their minister before
it goes to
the Council or the European Parliament can take a position on it.
So who formulates that policy? Who comes up with that idea?
The Commission makes the drafts, because the idea is a common body makes the draft.
Is that 28 members?
Yeah, one nominated by each national government. I'll come back to that. It's an important point. Yeah. So they make a proposal, goes to all the national parliaments. They can look at and mandate their ministers. Now, in the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, and so on, any minister going next week to a meeting of the EU Council goes this week in front of their national parliaments, committee, specialist committee perhaps, or the full parliament, says, right, this is what's on the agenda, this is the position I'm thinking of taking, and they debate it, and they tell him or her what to do before he goes off to Brussels. In Britain, we don't do that. The Parliament hears about it after the minister comes back, and that's, I think, but it's our fault. It's nothing to do with Europe. It's entirely our fault.
Is this a bit like Britain not really deporting people when it can, and not putting limits on people coming from Bulgaria and Romania when they could have done that?
They could have done.
We wanted to.
But we blame the EU for things that are entirely our fault.
Well, that's evident in a lot of things, isn't it? We blame the EU for not deporting people who have murdered or whatever, and it's...
Now, you're asking about the Commission.
Yeah.
So, the Commission is one commissioner nominated by each national government.
So who is our commissioner?
At the moment, it's Julian King,
right? Okay.
Who is a former ambassador. Normally, it's politicians that are appointed, former ministers or prime ministers that get nominated by each country.
Right.
Now, to take office, there's a couple of democratic steps in this. First, the European Union agrees on who's president of the Commission. How's that done? The national governments come together and make a proposal to the European Parliament, which has to vote to approve that president. We just did it for the next president.
Yeah.
And what? Contrast that to what happened in...
51% for that?
You need half of the members of the European Parliament at least to vote in favour. So even abstaining is like voting against. You need a positive threshold in favour.
Okay.
Yeah. Contrast that to our latest Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, who was appointed by the Queen recently. There wasn't a confirmatory vote in Parliament, let alone the country. Not even the House of Commons had a vote on him.
No, it's...
Nothing. The President of the Euro Commission has to get a majority in the European Parliament. Then, once the rest of the Commission is put together between the President and the national government of each country nominates somebody, the Commission as a whole has to get a vote of confidence from the European Parliament to take office. Before that vote, the Parliament for years now has said, right, we want a public hearing of each Commissioner in front of the Parliamentary Committee that corresponds to their responsibility. So the proposed Transport Commissioner goes to the Transport Committee, the Agriculture Commissioner to the Agriculture Committee, and so on. 3-hour public hearing, like in the US, the Senate, a grilling. Yeah, why do you think you're good for this job? What's your priorities? What are your qualifications? And so on. Now, I'd love to see that for British ministers in the House of Commons when they're appointed.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
Rees Moggs, what are your qualifications? I'm very rich and posh.
Yeah, it would be revealing, wouldn't it? I mean, Chris Grayling wouldn't have lasted more than 10 minutes. Would he? You know?
Failing Grayling.
I think he's failing upwards.
Yeah.
He's going to be our next Prime Minister, I'm pretty sure. It's unbelievable.
It's completely different, isn't it? I mean, I didn't realise that it was so scrutinised is the word, actually, isn't it? There's more scrutiny there. People go on about the EU and the European Commission not being scrutinised.
Yeah.
So
We've got no scrutiny here.
where does the notion come from of a gravy train and the idea that the president and the head of the commission, everything, are all powerful and get to sort of say what they want, and do what they want, and have no say in it?
To a large degree, their stories put about by Brexiters, anti-Europeans, and so on.
Okay.
Gravy train. Let's take MEPs' salaries. Basically, an MEP is paid more or less the same as an MP. It used to be that MPs were paid the same as a member of their own national parliament, so they were all paid different rates for the same job. Then they agreed a harmonised level, which was slightly less than what British MPs get. But then the pound went down in value, so it's
because of Brexit.
Because of Brexit, so it's now marginally more. But you know, it's
Gravy train
it's
people.
it's not actually any different, really. Sometimes the gravy train story is, but you don't pay tax. Well, you do. You pay tax twice, actually. First, the European Union, which taxes its own employees and members of parliament and so on, and then the UK tops that up with another a top-up income tax, so that together you're paying the same rate as you would if you were paid.
So you're basically paying British income tax and national insurance rate, but a proportion of that first goes back into the European Union.
Yes,
and
since it's paying for you anyway.
Yeah, so you're not getting a free lunch in effect by paying less tax.
No.
Is it performance-based? I mean, if you don't turn up to any of the meetings of the Fisheries Commission, for instance, do you get docked pay, or is it...
No, sadly, as in Westminster. And of course, I compared to Westminster, that was to a backbencher. If you're a committee chair or if you're a minister, then you're paid much more as an MP than you ever get as an MEP. But nobody complains about that. But it's odd that most people think it's the other way around.
If you're, no, it's all the same.
Yeah.
So
communism. I told you it was communism.
Communist, yeah. So what about the president? Which is that Mr.
President of the Commission?
Yeah.
Mr. Juncker. Yeah.
Mr. Juncker, do they get paid the same as an MEP? Is he actually an MEP as well?
There's a separation of powers.
Okay.
Unlike what we have in Britain.
We have it in Scottish courts, just not in English ones.
Many members of the Commission were previously MEPs or previously national ministers or even prime ministers like Mr. Juncker, but they are the executive, so they don't sit in Parliament. They have to appear before Parliament, answer questions, take part in debates, get yelled at, etc., answer parliamentary questions, can be thrown out by the Parliament in a vote of no confidence. That's another thing there. The Commission can be dismissed by a vote of no confidence by the European Parliament.
All 28 members.
Yeah, collectively, just as in the House of Commons, you have a collective vote of no confidence in the government.
But it would have to be a majority. It wouldn't have to be unanimous.
And it's not something that happens every day. But the fact that the Parliament can sack the Commission means that commissioners have to, pay attention to what Parliament says. Just like in Westminster.
So they get a similar salary to the MEPs.
They get a similar salary to ministers in a national government.
Right. Okay. So
yeah.
So we're building sort of Euro-myths here. So what's the one about not signing off the accounts? I keep hearing this one.
Yes, that's
what?
That's the EU. The EU's accounts. Now we have about 2% of public spending is what we do jointly at European level.
Okay.
98% of public spending is national or local. That 2% is in part things that by doing it together we save money at national level. You know, we have one air safety agency testing aircraft instead of 28 of them, one medicines agency, one chemicals agency. But it means we spend some money at European level through the EU budget. Now, at the end of every financial year, that budget is pored over by a court of auditors. And that gives...
Who appoints them? Where do they come from?
Each country appoints one auditor.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do they do? How's that done? Is that just a job interview, or is that something?
Each government does it, and
they're essentially a civil servant.
Yes, but specialist auditors.
Okay.
And the last, I think, I've lost count now because it changes every year. I think it's 15 years or so now that they've signed off the accounts every year. There was a problem in the past when they didn't.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So this is something
this myth perpetuates.
So people saying that it's
and when they weren't signed off, it was usually because this particular thing should have also been authorised by a signature by that one, and that particular thing. It's not that there was fraud. There were some cases of fraud, but most of the problems were not fraud. So it's compared to, say, the Department of Work and Pensions in the UK, which last I heard hadn't had its accounts signed off in that sense for donkey's years. It's a pretty good record.
It's so hypocritical.
It is, isn't it?
It's not democratic enough. Well, it is very democratic, and we've got an unelected monarch and an unelected House
Prime
of
Minister.
Yeah. Upper chamber, unelected.
Yeah.
Okay. So.
And everybody in an EU institution is either elected or appointed by somebody who is elected.
Everybody.
Yeah. The Commission is appointed by elected governments and approved by the elected Parliament.
Okay.
The Council is composed of ministers from elected governments.
Yeah.
The Parliament is directly elected, and the auditors are appointed by elected.
Well, that makes sense, because one of the problems in America in their system is, in some ways, they have too little democracy, i.e., the president. Everyone around the president in the executive is just given the job by the president.
Yeah.
No one votes on that. But then people do vote on the maddest stuff. I mean, like, you can vote on your mayor, fair enough, but then also the person who does the litter patrol.
Yeah, and the dog catcher.
And the dog catcher. What was the weirdest one I heard of? Commoners. In some states in America, commoners are elected.
That's
so
incredible,
people running
isn't it?
an election campaign to say, I'm going to tell you how your auntie died and whether it was murder or not, essentially.
Yeah.
And the biggest one in America that sort of fries my noodle is judges. Judges can be elected, and they'll go on TV and say, "I'm gonna throw everyone in jail, death sentences all around," and people vote for them, and they get a backhander by the private companies that
run the
built
prison.
The prison.
I thought you were going to say the private companies that built the guilloties.
Well, the private company that built Old Sparky, you know.
But so,
walk on the mile.
There's something that I mentioned a little bit earlier about what the EU could do better to make it more obvious to people how it all works and get people to learn about it. But I think that Brexit has actually done a really good job of educating people about the EU.
Yeah, in a way, at least the people who are willing and interested.
And it's also done a very good job of educating us about how deficient our parliament is, I've found, with Brexit. You know, and now people are really sort of, whether they still agree with Brexit or not, are now seeing the flaws in our system.
My colleagues from other European countries keep on asking me, how is it possible for the executive to suspend Parliament unilaterally for 5 weeks? I mean, how is that possible? You know, it's not normal.
We did even the executive.
Yeah.
It wasn't the cabinet.
It was
just the man. Yeah.
Now you can't. The Commission or the Council ministers can't just suspend the European Parliament. They can't. And the European Parliament is master of its own agenda. In Britain, the government normally controls the agenda of the House of Commons completely.
The House is Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Yeah, Jacob Rees-Mogg does it. The European Parliament decides its own agenda. It decides when it wants to discuss what and for how long, and to postpone or not.
It sounds to me as though the EU and the European Commission is actually more democratic than our system.
It does.
Yeah, well, in many ways it is. It's not always clear. It's a system with which people aren't always familiar, of course, and the European Union doesn't do itself any service by calling the head of each of its institutions a president. So you've got President of the Commission, President of the Parliament, President of the... So why not use the full variety of the English language and say Chairman of the Council, President of the European Council, that's
Leader
the
of
heads
the
of government, Governor of the Central Bank, Speaker of the Parliament, and Prime Commissioner. And then people would understand the different roles a little bit that, it would be more familiar. The EU's resources come, apart from some small things like when it levies fines on multinational companies
like Google,
etc., which goes into the central pot. The two main sources are the common external tariff. Now, tariff barriers, border taxes. We've eliminated that between EU countries as free trade. There's no customs tariffs, but there is a common tariff for goods coming in from elsewhere.
Yeah.
They're not very high, but they do bring in money. And so rather than all of that going to the country where the good has come in, the Dutch with the port of Rotterdam would cream off all the money, even though the goods are going on to Belgium, Germany, France, and so on. That goes into the central pot because it's a common external tariff.
Yeah.
And then the second resource, the biggest one now, is a tax, as it were, on each country according to its level of prosperity. So the richer you are, the more you pay in, and the poorer you are, the less you pay in.
So the figure that Boris Johnson put on the side of a bus, which we all know wasn't true, I mean, that was a basic Google search of £350 million per week, is we were roughly paying just under half that, actually, when you consider our, I think it's rebates that we were getting.
There's a rebate on our contribution because Britain secured a special rebate for Britain years ago. So it didn't take account of that. Didn't take account of what we get back.
Money's invested in this country.
It certainly didn't take account of the savings that we all make by doing some things jointly. By spending jointly at European level, you save money at national level. Expensive research programs, cancer research, very expensive. By having common programs, you get a bigger bung for your buck, as the Americans say.
Because Theresa May was talking about having her own sort of space program after we left. I mean,
the Galileo satellite system. It's bloody expensive putting satellites up. So we did it jointly as Europe. Now Galileo, we all have sat nav, don't we?
Yeah.
So doing that jointly saves a lot of money. Having to duplicate it with your own system is
madness, isn't it?
One of the things that I had to look at was how much trade we do with the EU, which is about £500 billion, I think, a year. No, sorry, 500 billion. Half a billion.
Half a trillion.
Half a trillion.
Half our traders with the European Union.
And the fact that we don't have to pay WTO tariffs on all the stuff coming in and all the stuff that we sell saves us loads of money and gets us customers that we wouldn't otherwise get if we were making the same product as France or Germany, but slapping on a 30% tariff on top, which then goes to that government. I suppose for the EU it'll go to the central pot for the EU.
There's no tariffs between EU countries.
But when we leave,
when we leave, then it go to the EU central pot.
Okay.
Now on trade, so there's that problem that if we leave that, our main trading partners, our neighbouring countries, you have that. And sometimes you hear Brexiteers say, well, yes, we'll leave the EU, but we'll have the freedom to make our own trade deals with the rest of the world. Now, hang on a minute. At the moment, we have trade deals with the rest of the world of various kinds, from full free trade deals to lesser ones, that we've negotiated as Europe through the EU. And because the European Union is the world's largest single market, it actually has some leverage, some muscle in those negotiations. Countries want to sell onto that market, so they give concessions and let us sell on their market. Now, if we leave the European Union, we drop out of all those deals. We have to replace them with our own separate deals with countries across the world negotiating just as Britain, without the muscle of the world's largest market behind us, and negotiating in a hurry because we've got to replace all these deals bloody quickly.
So
with America, we're going to swallow everything Trump wants in terms of selling us chlorinated chickens and God knows what else, and hormones
buying
and
our
beef
NHS.
and all that, because we'd be so desperate for a deal, or at least that's the risk.
And the thing is as well, that and I can't get through to some of these people, that yes, we could negotiate a trade deal that sells cars to Liberia. I think we were talking about earlier in the
Liberia, GDP per capita is $1.75
per person per day. That's their...
We're not going to sell too many Qashqais in Liberia.
Not
that way.
Not a single many, no Burberry jackets or handbags or whatever they are. And people fail to realise, yes, there's an awful lot of people in the world that we could trade with, But a lot of those people don't have a lot of money. One of the biggest economies in the world is China, which has got a massive GDP as a country. But that's on the basis of its population, that it has a massive number of millionaires and billionaires. Yeah. The GDP per head of capita is $8,500 per year.
Wow, is that low?
And it's that low. It's that simple.
It's been rising, but it's still low.
It's still low. And this is what I say, 5% growth in, say, China in the economy, a 10% growth in the economy of the Congo, 10% of nothing is still nothing, you know.
Well, I think we sell more to the Netherlands than we do to China.
Yeah, and we sell more to, we trade more with Ireland than we do with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa put together. Yeah. Sorry, Richard, I've wrecked your table there. Right.
It's all right.
Now, this cat that's wandered down the back here, is that like the EU equivalent of Larry the cat or something?
Well, it's a cat that enjoys free movement in this whole neighbourhood, because it wanders into and
but
out
it's
of
not yours. You've not brought
everybody's houses. No, it belongs to a neighbour.
You've not brought it from Brussels.
It thinks it owns all the houses around, but it's benefiting from the freedom of movement we've established in this cul-de-sac.
But we're throwing that freedom of movement that we have with the EU away. So
we're in the
we're
process
not going to be able to do this. We're not going to be able to work and even visit without asking permission from the countries that we go to.
Well, it's not going to be easier, and the degree of extra hassle is still unclear, but it's going to be extra hassle, that's clear. Not just for permission to visit or reasons, etc. Your car insurance at the moment is valid across
I've got to get a green card.
You don't even need to think about it. Now you're going to say, in this country, what do I need to do? Take out extra insurance, pay for it, take the forms with you, have the forms checked.
On a lot of the when No Deal was getting threatened earlier this year, I got in touch with my insurers and I said, look, I've got an apartment in Spain. I want to take the car, because I'm obviously a very wealthy, liberal, elite Ramona here in Yorkshire. But I've got an apartment. I want to take my car over, so I could go via France. I might go direct from Pompey to Bilbao in Spain. And they said, we'd better issue you a green card for France and Spain. I said, well, can't I just have a green card for Europe? And they said, no, you have to say where your green card is going to be valid. If all of a sudden I want to go to Germany, I can't.
Well,
because I won't have insurance. And it takes up to 4 weeks for the insurer to supply you with your green card.
Well, that's something that Kieran, the van driver, was telling us about. Although Turkey is part of the customs union, that only covers bringing stuff into the EU. Once they're in Bulgaria or Greece, I guess, going over the border, then every time they cross the national border, as a Turkish driver, they have to reapply with the documents. So if you're going through 5 different countries, a journey with a Turkish driver will take 5 times as long as a
potentially
with an EU driver, and our lorry drivers are going to be in the same boat.
So all this boring sorting out common rules and regulations on all this boring things like insurance and all that, in the end enables things to be much easier for people. And once it's taken away, you realise, oh shit, now I got to go through all these hassles and hoops.
It was one of the big lies, wasn't it? That we will have a bonfire of red tape. And now we're
getting more red tape.
More red tape.
My father's selling up at 83 years old and moving to France, and his health insurance is quoted at £570 a month. So you're going to have more red tape and pay more money for something that's already been sorted for us. It's madness.
And so this is a huge, obviously, a step back for Britain. But do you think that in the long run for the rest of Europe, that this is actually going to be a good thing for them to actually see what happens? Because I don't feel like we're being punished. I feel like we're punishing ourselves, but...
It's not a good thing for the EU to lose a member state for the first time in its history, and it causes hassles and stuff for them too. But one thing it has done, it's quite noticeable that those political parties in some other EU countries that were toying with saying, we should leave the EU too, follow Britain's example, none of them are saying that anymore. They've been watching what's happened the last 3 years, and we don't want to go down that road.
Marine Le Pen was barking for it in France, and they were talking about Frexit, weren't they? And now all of a sudden, even she's like shut up, hasn't she, really?
And the 5-star movement in Italy.
And the Danish, what do they call the people's... Right, anyway,
People's Popular Front of Judea.
yeah, that's one of them. Yeah, and elsewhere, but they've gone off that. People have seen.
But what about the charge that we are being bullied by the EU and the EU's picking on us and they're making an example of us?
Hang on. Well, the ones walking out the door and saying, "But we'd still like to use some of the facilities, please." And they're in the main being quite accommodating. So this idea that they're bullying us. And take, for instance, this famous Irish backstop.
The undemocratic backstop.
Somehow it's undemocratic. Even
It became undemocratic
Boris Johnson
when
did vote for it once.
Yeah.
Had agreed between democracies. But anyway, the initial proposal was that Northern Ireland only would have this system where it stayed aligned with EU regulations and customs to avoid checks on the border. So you would have those sort of checks between, as you do already for some agricultural products, between Ireland and Great Britain. And it was after the DUP said no, that Britain said no, we can't have that. Let's have the whole of the UK in the backstop. And that now, according to Johnson, was the EU tricking us to stay in the customs union, and it's mad. Now, on those checks, by the way, at the moment remember mad cow disease?
Yes.
Remember Ian Paisley, and remember they didn't want Northern Irish cows to be banned from the rest of the world, as British beef was all over the world because
of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease.
There wasn't any of that in Northern Ireland, so they didn't want to be caught up with it. So Ian Paisley said, we're British, but our cows are Irish. And from that point on, all that stuff was classified as Irish for that purpose. Yeah. They didn't mind that.
No.
That was fine.
But they see anything that severs them from the Great Britain as being against their...
It's against their union.
It's an existential threat to the DUP.
And
a party that voted against the Good Friday Agreement.
A party that is not too keen on marriage equality.
Oh yeah. Gay marriage is still illegal.
Yeah.
And
abortion
is illegal.
And they don't represent the majority of the Northern Irish population on Brexit because there was a huge majority to remain.
Yeah.
Yes.
And even more so now, according to opinion polls.
But the EU underpins the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement couldn't have worked without the EU.
And
because
it's written into the agreement even.
Because it
an
allows
agreement
the movement of both people and capital and goods and everything. This was already the framework.
And part of the agreement is to say you don't have to choose. If you're in Northern Ireland, you can be British, you can be Irish, you can be both. You can have both passports if you want. So those who are very keen on their links to Britain can keep their British passports, and they can keep. There's freedom of movement in all directions anyway. So it's a solution that enables people to be who they want to be.
But Boris Johnson's going to build an impossible bridge.
Is he still pushing that?
Yeah, that came out in the news again today, I think, didn't it?
They had an engineer look at it and say it's absolutely impossible.
Yeah.
Like, it just cannot be done.
It's a very deep trench there. And by the way, we dumped munitions.
Millions of tons of munitions in there after the end of the Second World War. Yeah.
Okay, so where do you think we're going with this? Do you think Brexit's going to happen? That's not an easy question to answer, is it?
Well, look at the situation now. We now have a minority government.
Yeah.
Every opposition party, Labour, Lib Dem, SNP, Welsh Nationalists, Green, and the dissident Conservatives and so on, all oppose a no-deal Brexit, all want a referendum on any outcome that Johnson comes up with, be it no deal or a deal, and all have said that in those circumstances they would campaign to remain. Public opinion has not exactly rallied behind the result. After the referendum, everyone thought, okay, that's settled it. Public opinion will now say, okay, it's sorted, let's rally behind it. No, it's gone the other way. It's not rallied behind it at all.
I think that's because some of the truth has come out about what they've actually voted for. Do you feel?
Well, it's quite clear now that Brexit, as it is emerging, bears no resemblance whatsoever to what was promised. They said it would be easy. It's turning out to have all kinds of ramifications that they never told us about. They said it would save all that money that would all go to the NHS. It's costing a fortune. They said it would be good for the economy and jobs. It's the exact opposite. So, of course, people are entitled, I'd say, to then have another say on it. It's like when you buy a house, you say, I'll have that, but then when the survey comes through, and it's got shaky foundations,
but you said
cracked
you said you
walls,
have it.
leaky roof, you have the right to say no thank you. Or to say, I'll have it anyway because it's a wonderful location, but you have the choice.
Yeah.
So why shouldn't the public have the choice on the actual Brexit deal, not just the idea? And it's Leave voters who surely are the most entitled to say, hang on a minute, this isn't what I voted for, that's not what I was promised.
Yeah, I mean, I think James O'Brien talks about this quite a bit as well, that 17.4 million people didn't vote for this. They voted for their idea of what Brexit was, be it keeping out the foreigners, be it taking back control, whatever it was. Nobody voted for what we've got now. 20% might say we did. And the problem is we were talking about Mr. Farage earlier, and believe you me, this is the most polite we've been about him in these videos. But Mr. Farage, he gets this, seems to get this, and Marc Francois and all of these in the ERG seem to get a disproportionate amount of time covered in the media, in the Sun and the Daily Mail and on Question Time. And some of it to me is, we had a saying in Australia, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And the problem is that they are very squeaky wheels, and they're getting an awful lot of oil. And I think that now, when you've got people at the sideline saying, well, I knew exactly what I was voting for, they're either, a lot of them are probably lying, because all it said in the government-sponsored leaflet about the referendum...
Well, they're not lying, but they're not going to get what they voted for.
Well, that's right, yeah. But all it said was we would leave the single market and the customs union. It didn't say anything about a deal, but all of the rhetoric and all of the propaganda, including Vote Leave and Leave.eu and Be Leave and all of these campaigns, all said, we will get a deal before we trigger Article 50. We will get the best deal. We will get a better deal than what we've already got. And now that is just not the case. And people are still saying, well, I voted for this. And they didn't. How could they?
And the other thing is, if you go ahead with Brexit as a country, you have an unpalatable choice to make. Either you distance yourself from the EU, outside the customs union, the single market and so on, and you take a huge economic hit. Or you decide you don't want that economic hit, you attenuate it at least, and stay close to the European Union, inside the single market, like Norway is, more or less.
Which is a deal that Farage said we could have.
Indeed, yeah. But then you have less of an economic hit, but you have to follow all the rules without having a say on them if you're not a member anymore.
Yeah.
So you become a vassal state.
Yeah.
So economic catastrophe or vassal state, that's the choice if you want to go ahead with Brexit. So it's not surprising that more and more people are saying, well, actually, we don't have to go ahead with it. As David Davis said, if a democracy cannot change its mind, it ceases to be a democracy.
David Davis.
Yeah.
What a
Remember
guy.
him?
I remember him.
Yeah.
And you were re-elected in the Euro elections this year.
Yep.
And you were out on the streets around Bradford. I know you probably came down to Rotherham, where I live. And there are, is it 3 MEPs for Yorkshire and the Humber?
6.
There's 6, sorry. So how many are Labour?
There's, of the 6, there are 1 Labour, 1 Green, 1 Liberal Democrat, and 3 Brexit Party.
Brexit Party
So
Company Limited.
3 supporting Brexit and 3 against Brexit.
Right, okay. What was your feeling on the streets when you were campaigning? I mean, because the Conservatives didn't campaign at all, did they, of course? But I'm guessing you did.
They did a bit, but we did more, yeah. We, frankly, Labour lost a lot of votes to the Greens and the Liberal Democrats because they hammered us by saying that we weren't sufficiently clear in our commitment to have a referendum on any Brexit outcome. And if you read our manifesto, it was hedged around with caveats, so they were able to attack us on that. We clarified our position afterwards. It would have been better to have done so before. But overall, it was interesting. Of course, it's still a divisive issue. There are strongly held views, but the fact that Yorkshire splits, as it were, 3-3, whereas at the time of the referendum there was a majority to leave, it shows that there is this
there is this drift,
drift in opinion.
Right.
If we do get a referendum, I don't like calling it a second referendum. I like calling
It's the first referendum
first,
on the actual deal.
Well, no, I like to call it a first referendum where no one's allowed to cheat or lie or break the law.
That would also be good.
That would be great.
And we're presented with the facts.
Yes. So that'd be great.
Yeah.
But I do feel that there is, rather than just us saying, listen, this is going to be really bad if we leave, we can either be a vassal state or we can just live in economic
You'd rather focus on the positives.
I'll focus on the positive, and this is something that I think has been a failing of the EU, which is it just doesn't blow its own trumpet enough.
And
No,
certainly
because
on
it's,
the Remain campaign,
You imagine if it was America, right?
Yeah.
And like the US government had paid for a bridge or paid for a sports centre. They're not
Well, in the
George
referendum,
Washington on the side of it with his thumbs up going.
In the referendum, the EU and the Commission and so on kept well out. So, well, this is a national referendum. It's up to British politicians to argue it, and we can't interfere. And in a way, I think you should, at the very least, have corrected some of the lies that were told about it. I think that's
yes,
absolutely true.
that's
because otherwise, the silence looks like, oh well, they've got us.
yeah.
And why, come back to why do we have this European Union in the first place? I would say there's three reasons why we should have it and why we should be in it.
Yeah.
Very different: idealistic, pragmatic, and selfish. Idealistic goes back to why this process started in the first place after the Second World War.
Peace project.
A peace project. A continent where every generation from the fall of the Roman Empire till 1945 had gone out and slaughtered each other on the battlefields. We had to find a better way of doing things. That was the original motivation. We still have our arguments now,
Of course,
but across a negotiating table or a debating chamber, it's somewhat better than what we used to do.
Yeah.
And we should not sneeze at that. It's a huge achievement. The second is pragmatic. Whether we like it or not, we're a group of neighbouring countries that are highly interdependent. Economically, environmentally, in all kinds of ways, it makes sense to work together to solve those problems that you can't so easily handle by yourself. That's why we have a structure that enables us to do that. Again, we still have arguments about it, but we hammer out solutions. That's a good thing. And the third is selfish for Britain, especially as a trading nation, but for all of these countries. It's become vital economically. Most of our trade is with the rest of Europe. To cut yourself off from your neighbours is shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, and there's economic gravity, which means that you trade more with the people
With
around
people
you
closer to you,
than people on the other side of the world.
And
Especially
then
the people on
Boris
the other side of the
Johnson,
world
now, talking
who
of
have no
shooting
money.
yourself in the foot. I mean, Boris Johnson's saying, we've got to threaten no deal to the European Union so they give us a good deal. That's like saying, give me what I want or I'm going to shoot myself. You know, it's not a threat. This isn't a business deal where you can walk away and it's the status quo. If you walk away from a deal, you're leaving the cliff edge without a deal. So the worst way of leaving the European Union, because overnight, all current rules, arrangements, programs suddenly cease to exist. You drop out of them. The insurance problem, the aircraft landing rights, everything suddenly, choom.
We are in near Bradford, and as part of the liberal Ramonin elite, we're at a semi-detached house, albeit with a nice view. It's a semi-detached house. You would not burn your house down and then say, "Oh, I'll look for a new house," would you? I mean, that's what a deal is. If you're looking to move house, you don't burn your house down and then say, "I don't want that house," or say, "I want that house," and burn your house down. You go back to the status quo. If you don't want that house, you stay in this one. You know, that's...
Well, it's like going for a promotion at work and saying, all right, give me the promotion or I'm going to leave. And it's like, okay.
On you go. See you later.
Okay. It's like you say, it's not going back to your old job. It's literally, that's it. You're done with the company.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you wind up on the streets. I mean, it's not ideal, is it?
When Mr. Farage, because when I came back from Australia and all these people were going on about Farage and all that kind of stuff, and I saw a video that he put on YouTube about this EU gravy train. He says once a month everyone pulls up stumps and they trot to Strasbourg and then they come back and all this kind of stuff. Is there any truth in that?
Well, it's true that MEPs go every week normally to the European Parliament, just as MPs
go every week.
Constituencies up here in Yorkshire go down every week to Westminster to do their job. Yes, that's the job, is to be the link between the local constituents.
So do they pull up everything in Brussels and take it to Strasbourg?
You're talking about the difference between Brussels and Strasbourg.
Yeah.
Well, that's you were asking earlier about things that the EU could change. That's something that it could change. Unfortunately, that's a decision for the national governments under the treaties. It wasn't the EU institutions, certainly not the European Parliament, that decided that. Most of the European Parliament would very happily sit the whole time in Brussels and not have this 1 week a month.
Can you just
Strasbourg.
explain to me why are the two parliaments? Why have you got one in Brussels and one in Strasbourg?
Well, historically, before the European Union was set up, a body called the Council of Europe was set up. Still exists.
Still exists.
It has 40 odd countries.
Yeah.
Russia even is in it. Yeah. And it had a parliamentary assembly composed of delegates from national parliaments that met in Strasbourg. So there was a parliamentary chamber equipped with interpretation equipment there. So when the EU was set up, it was all very small then, the coal and steel community originally, and it had its, for the reasons we discussed earlier, it had its own parliament to ensure parliamentary accountability, initially also from delegates from national parliaments. It only met periodically then. So they said, oh, can we use this same parliamentary chamber? Because it's there, it's Strasbourg, even though the EU institutions were set up in Brussels and Luxembourg. So that was all right when it was all pretty small and it was members of national parliaments who met periodically. But as it grew, it would have made sense to put them all in the same place. But France said, oh no, Strasbourg's so important symbolically because, remember, Alsace. It was German, then it was French, then it was German, then French. They fought over it time and time, and Strasbourg was seen as the symbol of reconciliation, where you could all come together. As John Hume so eloquently said in his Nobel Prize speech that he won for the peace process in Northern Ireland. But I digress. That's why it was Strasbourg. But then it needed to be sorted out legally because there were constant arguments on it, not least the European Parliament trying to shift everything to one place, to Brussels, and France saying, no, you can't do that. And at the Edinburgh summit, chaired by John Major, do you remember him?
Yes.
In the news last week, taking Boris Johnson to court.
That's a good thing he's doing now. But at that time, he was often trying to placate the right wing of his party.
The Eurosceptics.
But anyway, the Edinburgh summit, in exchange for some declaration on subsidiarity, he agreed to a French demand that it become legally binding in law that the European Parliament has to have 1 week a month in full session in Strasbourg. The rest of the time it's in Brussels, where the other institutions are.
So once a month, everyone goes to Strasbourg.
Now, is that it's stupid, it's silly, but MEPs going from their constituencies to Brussels or to Strasbourg, that's not a huge difference in cost.
No.
The waste is having an extra building, which France kindly built without Parliament ever asking for it. The French built a building for the European Parliament in Strasbourg.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, French taxpayer, whatever. But it is silly. It's a waste of everybody's time. That's true. So that's one thing.
So if that's the worst thing on the gravy train,
the stuff that needs to be improved is like we need to give better titles for the leaders, so not all core presidents, and we need to stop going to Strasbourg once a month. Whereas in the UK...
On structures, on policies, there's of course plenty to argue about all the time, just as there is at national level or at local government level. Yes.
So in the UK, we've got the fact that we have the Prime Minister is not directly elected.
Or not even elected by Parliament.
The Prime Minister has the power to prorogue Parliament, and apparently that power is unlimited. So they can prorogue Parliament as long as they like.
And as often as they like.
For any reason they like. They're just not allowed to lie about it.
Apparently.
Anyway, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Richard,
we've taken up too much of your time.
It was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you, Richard.
Enlightening.
Pleasure.
Right. And we've run out of Yorkshire tea.
You want to drink some more?
No, but what we normally do here is we say,
oh, I see.
Here's to the EU.
Here's to the EU.
Cheers.
Cheers. And thank you for watching.